I'm Jeremy Scahill from Dropsite News, dropsitenews.com. Thank you so much for joining us. This is something new that we're trying, a live broadcast meant to be an informal conversation, the kind of discussion that we have in our virtual newsroom at Dropsite. And we're going to be discussing a number of issues, mostly focused on the war in Gaza, the broader wars in the Middle East, the emerging and active police state tactics that have been unleashed inside of the United States, intensified under the administration of Donald Trump. There's a range of issues that we're going to discuss. And as we do this, let's remember that as we are here, the Israeli military is continuing its campaign of massive airstrikes in Gaza that it resumed on March 18th, following Israel's abandonment and violation of the ceasefire agreement that it agreed to on January 17th, 2025, that went into effect 2 days later. You also have Israel intensifying once again its attacks against Lebanon, conducting airstrikes over the past several days, including some very, very heavy strikes in the suburbs of Beirut. The Israelis say that they're targeting Hezbollah people that are supposedly conspiring with Hamas to engage in imminent attacks, but we understand that civilians are once again being killed. And remember that more than 4,000 Lebanese died in the Israeli aerial bombardment campaign and ground invasion that Israel engaged in. And there is supposedly a ceasefire there. The late Palestinian poet and scholar Rafat al-Arir said that Israel's definition of a ceasefire is that the other side ceases and Israel continues to fire. And we're certainly seeing evidence of that. At the same time, we have the United States engaged in some of the heaviest, if not the heaviest, bombing that the U.S. has ever done against the nation of Yemen. Donald Trump has been posting on social media about that. We all also were welcome to read some of the top secret signal chats that J.D. Vance and others were on. We're going to talk about all of this, and we're also going to talk about some of the secret agreements that lurk behind Donald Trump's deportation policy, sending people to El Salvador. Our colleagues Ryan Grimm and Jose Olivares recently broke a very important story about that. So I'm going to be joined here by a number of my colleagues. Regular readers of Dropsite will know who all of them are. I'll begin with my fellow co-founder of Dropsite, Ryan Grimm. How you doing, Ryan?
Good. How you doing, Jeremy?
We have Murtaza Hussain, a reporter for Dropsite as well. Hello, Maz. Maz also was recently on MSNBC with Ayman Mohyeldin discussing those U.S. attacks against Yemen. And then Dropsite's Middle East editor and reporter, Sharif Abdel Quddus. Sharif, how are you?
Hi, Jeremy. Good to be with you guys.
And I would encourage people also to read the latest articles that we've posted on Dropsite. I mean, internally, we like to say that we're a very small newsroom, but we are trying to keep up with a very fast-paced 24-hour news cycle. And also, I know people have complicated feelings about Twitter or X, whatever it is, but we have a group of people who are around the clock operating our feed on X like a 24-hour news service. And, if you've left X because of the toxicity of the politics of the owner or whatever, if you have any sense that you want to reconsider that, the Dropsite News feed on X would be a good reason to do so. But let's kick off here, Sharif, with the latest developments that we're seeing out of Gaza. Yet another journalist was killed this morning in a direct strike on his house. It also killed his wife and his 3 children. You now have bakeries throughout Gaza that no longer have flour. Many reporters in Gaza are stating that they've gone around to bakeries and there's just no bread anymore. Israel has imposed this full spectrum blockade since March 2nd, resumed intense bombing since March 18th. Talk a bit about, Sharif, what we're seeing right now, and we'll also get into some of what's happening with the ceasefire negotiations. But first, just give us a sense of what the current situation looks like.
Yeah, we're back to, I wake up every day to get the latest bulletin alert from the Ministry of Health of the number of Palestinians killed in Gaza. And it's back to like a daily toll of dozens every day, 40, 50 Palestinians killed. And then we're seeing the scenes of what is a resumption, and in some ways, somehow a more concentrated resumption of this genocidal assault that we're seeing, really horrific scenes. And it's very, very hard to keep up with and to understand what's happening on the ground and the scale of it. And as you mentioned, we are a small news team, but actually, um, we work with so many reporters on the ground that we are quite like a large news team in many ways, and we're very honored to work with these journalists in Gaza who report for us. We're still all of us reeling from the loss of Hossam Shebat last week when he was brutally assassinated by the Israeli military. We recently spoke with and published yesterday four of the five other journalists who were named in October alongside Hussein. Essentially, the Israeli military put them on a hit list, saying that they were militants with Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and calling them terrorists, and essentially calling them out and saying that they were going to kill them. This is Talal al-Aroui, Ala Salama, Ashraf al-Sarraj, Anas al-Sharif, and Ismail Abu Omar, who was actually wounded back in February of last year and is outside of Gaza. But all of them have said that how shocking it was when Hussein was murdered, how they feel that they're next, and at the same time saying that they will continue to report, that they will not stop their work that they find crucial. And it's very hard to imagine what it must be like to be reporting under the crosshairs, so explicitly threatened by a military that has complete control over the space that it's dominating and bombing and surveilling and invading. And again, yeah, we've seen at least 2 journalists killed since Hossein was killed. And we've also seen increased displacement orders happening in Gaza. Just the other day, the entire area of Rafah was ordered to be displaced. We saw really horrific scenes of just mass exodus of people trying to get out of Rafah to Mawasi, which is an area basically on the beach, very squalid area packed with tents. And Rafah, of course, is this area where there was a very horrific attack on March 23rd in the Tel al-Sultan area. And this is where we're seeing I think what will be a seminal massacre of emergency workers and healthcare workers. 15 medics and emergency workers were basically executed in cold blood by the Israeli military. And we're getting more and more information as that comes out. But basically, a team went in on March 23rd to try and rescue people who were fleeing this brutal Israeli assault. They disappeared. Other teams were sent in to try and rescue them. They disappeared. And it wasn't until Sunday that the Israeli military, through a lot of coordination with the United Nations, allowed a group of civil defense and Red Crescent and UN workers to go in to this area. And what they discovered was horrific. Essentially, there was the bodies of 15 Red Crescent civil defense and 1 UN worker buried in a mass grave a few meters under the ground. Eyewitnesses, the spokesperson for civil defense, said that some of the bodies, their feet were bound. One of them had the upper clothes removed. Almost all of them had multiple gunshots to the chest. They were buried a few meters away from the ambulances that were also buried, seemed to have been like buried under, pushed with the dirt pushed over by bulldozers. And the Israeli military admitted under a lot of pressure that it did fire on the ambulances. It tried to justify that by saying that they were approaching them without sirens or something like this. But
advancing suspiciously,
right,
was one of the classic phrases that they've now introduced into the lexicon.
It's just beyond comprehension. I mean, this level of killing of something like healthcare workers. This is coming also, let's remember, it's coming over a year after 2 Red Crescent workers who went to try and rescue Hind Rajab with coordination from the Israeli military and approval through the Israeli military to go and try and rescue Hind Rajab, the 6-year-old girl who was trapped in a car surrounded by the dead members of her family after the Israeli military opened fire on it. And they shelled that ambulance as well and killed both of those workers. So this is not new, but the level of this, just the scale, is what's scary, is what is really shocking this time around.
Ryan, I wanted to ask you one follow-up related to this. Tammy Bruce, the new State Department spokesperson, she took over from Matt Miller, and you did a lot of jousting with him during the Biden administration, where you would go and ask tough questions what reporters should be doing. But there's only been a handful of these State Department press briefings, but this pattern has already become very clear, where reporters ask serious questions about American policy, American stance, American weapons. How does the United States view the application of international humanitarian law? And it doesn't, correct me if I'm wrong, you follow this at a more, minutia-based level than I do, but it seems like the strategy that Tammy Bruce is employing is that no matter what happens, no matter how grave the crime that Israel has committed, even if Israel has acknowledged that it was involved with the incident reporters are talking about, the answer from the Trump administration from Tammy Bruce specifically, is always immediately to talk about Hamas. And it's, of course, Biden's people would often pivot to that. None of this would be happening if it wasn't Hamas. Hamas could end this today, if they just did X, Y, and Z, which is, of course, a lie if you read Netanyahu's, statements about his actual agenda. But I wanted to ask you about that. In the whole span of history since you've started doing journalism, or even what about history prior to that, have you seen a posture like this, so blatantly just, we will not answer any questions, we're just going to repeat Hamas, Hamas, Hamas in response to whatever you ask?
This is new, and it you can go back, any contemporary president, from Reagan, through Clinton to Bush and on, would start with the premise that America upholds these particular values and believes in international humanitarian law. And that's where the jousting, say with Matt Miller, begins, because they claim this pretense of believing in humanitarian law, believing in that, America is a force for good, and the gap between their actions and their stated ideal values is where you can have the give and take. You say you support, not killing innocent civilians. Here are 16, medics or 15 medics and a UN worker that were just killed. Like, how do you explain that? And the gap there gives the question the moral urgency that forces an answer, and then later a pivot to Hamas. And what is, you're right to put your finger on this, what is unique about Bruce in particular and the Trump administration more broadly is that they don't start from that premise. And maybe that's a helpful thing that we've dispatched with this fiction that the U.S. Believes in international humanitarian law, etc. But they don't start from there. What she says in every single answer is, if all of this is the responsibility of Hamas, and that might be a direct quote. Like, I think she has said, anything that happens in Gaza is the direct responsibility of Hamas, whether it was Hamas had anything to do with it or not, because Hamas is evil and Hamas is forcing Israel to do all of these things. So it is a kind of it's a new approach. It's a very kind of almost online, right-wing online approach, just being brought into kind of spokesperson form behind the podium. I've only been to the first briefing. Partly I've had conflicts and haven't been able to make the others, but also the lack of that gap between their stated values and their actions means that there isn't actually any moral urgency to your questions, and you'll just continue to get the same answer. And also, she's said a couple times that she really has no idea. Like, she'll say, "Look, I work for Marco Rubio and I work for Donald Trump, and these are men that have strong opinions, and you should ask them. And Donald Trump holds multiple press conferences every day. And it's not obvious that Tammy Bruce actually does have any idea what the policy is at any particular moment. So that's another reason that those briefings are becoming less interesting. I don't know if you saw yesterday, she was asked, some of the pro-Israel groups that are putting forward names to the administration to have them deported have put forward the names of naturalized American citizens who participated in protests. Can you comment on whether or not the State Department is going to be taking action against any American citizens who took part in protests? Every administration, going back to the beginning, except maybe didn't John Adams flirt with kicking out some people who were too close to France or whatever? Like everybody else would be like, no, we are not going to be investigating American citizens for participating in protests when it comes to deporting them. And she just said, I'm not going to comment on that, which is just kind of a striking place to get to.
Maz, I wanted to ask you. We'll come back to Gaza because I also want to talk about the broader situation with the so-called ceasefire negotiations, and if there's going to be a resumption of some form of a truce. And it's really complicated what's happening right now. And of course, the narrative always is going to be that Hamas is rejecting peace. But Maz, I did want to ask you first for a response, because I know you follow the situation with Iran very, very closely, to these latest comments from Donald Trump. When they started attacking in an intense way Yemen and saying that they were going to degrade and try to decapitate the Ansar Allah, commonly known as the Houthis. They were saying that Trump also issued a warning to Iran, and then this week he tells NBC News that if the U.S. decides to bomb Iran, it's going to be the likes of which they've never seen before. What's happening there? Because there also has been some rumblings that there may actually be indirect or even potentially direct negotiations on Iran's nuclear program and trying to have some resolution with the U.S.
So this issue of the nuclear program, I think we're in a 15-year period now where it's finally reaching a pinnacle in the sense that the program in Iran has advanced to a point where it can't really be rolled back or controlled in the same way that it was absent a significant diplomatic agreement like the one that existed in 2015, but which Trump reneged on, seemingly to spite his predecessor, Barack Obama. Now, Iran is pretty much a nuclear threshold state, and a decision has to be made what to do about that. So Trump has laid out two possibilities. As you mentioned, he said that there could be a negotiated deal, and if there's not, there's going to be bombing like you've never seen before. And he even gave a timeline for that. He said there should be in 2 months. The issue is this is a very technical, difficult negotiation to have. You need to have foreign organizations and parties, monitoring organizations involved. And there's a difference between dismantling the entire nuclear program and ballistic missiles and other things that Mike Waltz has suggested is a prerequisite, and putting limited controls on enrichment, which is a more attainable goal. Even then, the time frame that he's articulating this is very, very unlikely. And the way he's articulating it, too, is something which is going to, obviously, it probably is antagonizing the Iranian leadership. The 2015 negotiations were a very delicate process, mutual expressions of respect and so forth. These are very proud people, and they may actually choose to have a war as opposed to be talked down to in the way that Trump is doing at the moment. I think the issue is now that Israel is signaling very strongly it's ready to bomb Iran's nuclear program and other sites. They already, in their mind, had a test run when they bombed Iran after the ballistic missile attacks last year. The U.S. has deployed B-2 bombers into the region, and Diego Garcia, which have the capability of carrying 30,000-pound bombs, which would be necessary for destroying Iran's hardened nuclear sites. And there's not really a obvious diplomatic solution at the moment. There's indirect talks taking place, but the idea that they'll be successful in 2 months, as Trump has articulated, if that's a serious goal, is very, very remote. I think we're actually coming at the point where a war with Iran, which no one really wanted for many, many years, except for people in Israel, perhaps, is now almost, if not certain, very, very likely. And I think you cannot underestimate the danger of this in the sense that, I'll give you an example. There are 2 nuclear sites in Iran which are very, very important. They're called the Fordow site and Natanz site. These are very, very deeply buried sites. they can't really be destroyed with conventional military equipment. They can't be destroyed with normal bombs and so forth. That's why the B-2s are important, because the 30,000-pound bombs might be able to destroy them, but it's not even clear that they could. So I think if Iran really does race for a bomb now, which is very, very possible, given they have lost every other deterrent, and Hezbollah and other militant groups, the allies in the region who have been seriously weakened by Israel, they may dash for a bomb to test a nuclear weapon. And if they do, or if they make that decision, the US and Israel will probably know beforehand. They'll have intelligence knowing that the preparations are taking place. And I wouldn't count out the possibility of a preemptive attack on Iran. And even it sounds hyperbolic, I wouldn't count out a tactical nuclear weapons attack on Fardo or Natanz by Israel. If the US doesn't take part and the 30,000-pound bombs are not effective, the use of nuclear weapons against Iran preemptively is not by any means a unrealistic scenario. I think that's where we are right now. It's a product of a previous decision by Trump to shut down the JCPOA, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, and set us on the path which was inevitably leading us to this point at some point.
Well, just curious on that. What is the expected response from Iran at that point? I know in the past they would have said, "Oh, we can't do that because Iran has, they've got mortars pointed at all our troops in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere." Does Israel and the U.S. feel like their proxies are sufficiently weakened that Iran doesn't have the deterrent capacity anymore? Or like what is the expected response if they dropped a 30,000-pound bomb or even like a tactical nuclear weapon?
So one of the major points of leverage that Iran had was Hezbollah. It's a card that they built for 30 years to be their deterrent against Israel. So Hezbollah was supposed to be there to defend Iran's nuclear program in the situation. What happened in Gaza in the past year, you see what happened. Hezbollah was very weakened by the pager attacks and the Israeli bombing and so forth. They can't really play that role anymore. What Iran does have are ballistic missiles. And you saw the ballistic missile attacks in Israel last year. But these are reasonably effective ballistic missiles. And after the killing of Qasem Soleimani, they did a demonstration. They didn't attack directly to aim to kill Americans, but they hit the Ain al-Assad military base in Iraq. And they showed that the weapons have great precision at that range. They were not as precise at the range of targeting Israel from Iran, but in the range of Iran to Iraq, they can hit a precise building with great accuracy. I think that if there is a full-scale war, you will likely see Iran use those ballistic missiles against American military bases if America is as likely involved in the war. Iraq, Syria, the Gulf Arab states potentially, where the U.S. has military presence. I think those would very likely be targeted. Issue is that I'm sure the U.S. has scoped out the likely areas that Iran would be targeting from. They probably have other measures in place, cyber warfare and so forth, to anticipate this, because everyone knows Iran will play that card. So it's hard to say how effective this would be, but that's what the strongest weapon that Iran has left now, the ballistic missiles, and they have anything else, and that will be the crux upon any retaliation will hinge.
Yeah, I think also if we look at the last time Iran kind of responded to anything was when Israel really ramped up its war against Hezbollah with the pager attacks, and then culminating kind of in the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah and this all-out assault. And it felt like Iran was going to be next. And it responded by basically warning the United States and therefore Israel that it was going to conduct a missile strike. And it launched a bunch of missiles towards Tel Aviv, but showing that they could overwhelm their Iron Dome system, and it did manage to overwhelm the Iron Dome system. But by then, everyone had kind of been in bomb shelters. I don't think anyone was even wounded. Someone was killed, a Palestinian in Jericho, because a missile was hit by the Iron Dome. So it was a very kind of measured response. So we'll have to see where that goes. And of course, all of this is kind of spiraling because of Gaza, because of Israel's genocidal assault in Gaza. And just to go back to that, Jeremy, you had asked about also the humanitarian situation. And, we've done reporting, food is literally running out. This is the longest complete siege since October 2023, when they didn't allow anything in. Tomorrow will mark exactly 1 month of not a single truck of any medicine, of any food, of any fuel going in. We've done reporting showing how people in Gaza City, they're literally foraging for wild plants for food. One family found a sea turtle that had washed ashore and cut it open and ate it. And the man described how this was, he felt like it was an assault on his dignity that he had to do this, but he was trying to feed his family. But you've followed closely how the ceasefire fell apart and where talks are going now. So if you kind of explain, because the mainstream narrative is that Hezbollah rejected a deal, and that's why this all resumed again last week.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the dominant line from both the Biden administration when they were in power and now the Trump administration, as well as at times the Israeli government, is that if Hamas immediately releases all Israeli captives and returns the bodies of all deceased Israeli captives, that all this ends right away. And that's been a lie from the very beginning, because in order for that to be true, then there wouldn't have been an October 6th or an October 5th or a 2021 or a 2014 or a 2011 or a 1948. There's a whole arc of history that shows very clearly that the issue is not that Hamas is holding Israeli citizens captive, and the lie that if they simply were to release the Israeli captives, that suddenly everything would be finished. The agenda is to finish the Palestinian people off on their land, to remove the Palestinians, not just from Gaza, but from 48 territory, from the occupied West Bank, from occupied Jerusalem. This is an annihilationist agenda that has been in force for decades, and we're now seeing the naked face of it in front of the world. So before we talk about anything regarding negotiations, we have to be clear on the very big fact at play here. But to just back up a little bit, you had last summer, in May of 2024, Joe Biden come out publicly before the world and announce what was being referred to as the Biden plan to bring a ceasefire to the war against Gaza. And Biden actually touted the fact that that plan was crafted largely based on ideas put forward by Israel. And then the United States endorses a resolution at the UN Security Council. The US had vetoed many of the resolutions there. And in early June, the UN Security Council endorsed that framework for a ceasefire. And, you know, a lot of times people don't understand the way that this works, but often what happens is that the US or Qatar or Egypt, those are the two main regional mediators, will put a proposal on the table. And Israel gives feedback on it, and Hamas and other Palestinian factions, as part of the negotiating team that they have, give feedback on it, and it kind of goes back and forth. And eventually you get down to a handful of issues, and then there are amendments proposed. And Israel has repeatedly sabotaged that process. But last summer, by July 2nd, Hamas had agreed formally to a ceasefire deal. And that ceasefire deal happened because the United States came back to the Qatari and Egyptian mediators and said, we've amended language in a couple of parts of this, and Israel has approved it. Will Hamas agree to this? On July 2nd, Hamas agreed to it. In fact, we were shown documents at the time, Sharif, that showed that Hamas had formally informed the mediators that they agreed to this proposal based on American amendments. And then Netanyahu blew up the deal, and Biden and his team were leaking to insider Beltway journalists how frustrated Biden was, how angry Biden was. They were doing these targeted leaks. But then there were no consequences of note for Netanyahu or Israel. They just continued then to shower them with weapons, with political support. And then you have the assassination of Hamas's top negotiator, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran, and he was assassinated while in a guest house controlled by the most elite military force in Iran. Then you had an intensification of Israeli attacks, and there was no discussion anymore about a ceasefire. Then in September, Israel launches this full-scale aerial assault and ground invasion of Lebanon, and Netanyahu is running around the Middle East like an arsonist with full U.S. backing. Then the U.S. elections happen. Biden steps aside. Harris is there. There's this moment when Harris could have tried to do a clean break from Biden policy. You know, a lot of people were saying, oh, Harris is a voice of moderation within the administration. She definitely had made statements that seemed to be aimed at showing more compassion toward Palestinian suffering. I mean, it's a joke what US officials say when they mention anything about the Palestinians, but people were saying, well, Harris actually, if you look at it early on, she started talking about the plight of the Palestinians, but she doesn't do that. In fact, she goes on national television and says, there's nothing that I would do differently from Joe Biden. And that was a factor. Ryan has done reporting on this based on polling, et cetera. That was a factor, a fairly significant one, in Donald Trump winning the presidency. So Trump wins the presidency, and he starts saying that if there isn't a deal in place, and if captives, he says, hostages don't start coming home by the time that I'm sworn in, all hell is going to break loose. There's going to be hell to pay. And that was often portrayed as a threat toward Hamas, but it was clear that there was also pressure applied from Trump's people on Netanyahu to make a deal before Trump's inauguration. So that happens. And Trump, instead of having Antony Blinken and Bill Burns, the CIA director, you have Trump's business people buddies like Steve Witkoff, and then later Jared Kushner's college roommate, Adam Bowler, being kind of the point people in dealing with a lot of this. So then this deal gets put in place that is almost identical down to the word from the original agreement that Hamas had said they would accept back in July, which raises all kinds of questions about the preceding months. That deal, though, is repeatedly violated by Israel after they sign it. They killed more than 130 Palestinians. They never allowed in anywhere near the quantity of tents that they were supposed to. 200,000 tents, 60,000 mobile homes, fuel to have generators running in the hospitals, 600 trucks a day of food and medicine were supposed to go in. A significant percentage of that came in, but they still stalled large parts of it, according to local Palestinian health ministry sources. So Netanyahu was supposed to begin negotiating for the second phase of that deal 16 days into that first 42-day phase that went into effect on January 19th. He refuses to send negotiators. Instead, he goes to Washington. He becomes the first foreign leader to meet with Trump after his reelection. And then Trump makes his announcement that the U.S. intends to seize Gaza as a U.S. territory and turn it into what Trump referred to as a Middle East Riviera. Now, he didn't say an Israeli-owned Riviera, and that may be something that Netanyahu didn't like. But what Netanyahu loved, and what is a huge factor in what's happening right now, is this notion stated out loud by the President of the United States that the removal of Palestinians from Gaza was, in fact, the aim. That was the aim. So Netanyahu then proceeds to tell his cabinet, listen, we had to sign this deal. And, there were stories about Witkoff making him meet on Shabbat and et cetera. And I think there's some legitimacy to that. I don't think that Biden's people would have closed this deal if they had continued on. But Netanyahu goes back and he tells his security cabinet, I have side letters, side agreements from outgoing President Biden and incoming President Trump that says if Israel decides it's not in our strategic interest to continue on with negotiations, we don't have to do it and we can resume the war. So it goes right up to the last day, March 1st, when there was supposed to be the beginning of a second phase. Israel hadn't sent any negotiators until a couple of days before that. And then the day after, they impose a full spectrum blockade on Gaza. Then March 18th, they start scorched earth bombing. They kill nearly 200 children in a matter of hours on the opening moments of that bombing. That continues to this moment as we speak right now. And what's happened in recent days is that the negotiators from Qatar, the mediators from Qatar and Egypt, have gone to Hamas with a proposal that is largely based on a U.S. concept that was put forward by Steve Witkoff and to an extent Adam Bowler, who was the special envoy on hostages. And Adam Bowler, who was the college roommate of Jared Kushner, engaged in direct talks with Hamas. I've spoken with Hamas officials who met with Adam Bowler, and there was real progress being made there. Hamas negotiators were saying, look, we understand the dynamic here. We know Trump and everyone is in his administration that they are militant Zionists. We have no illusions that we're dealing with people that care at all about the Palestinians, but we do feel like at least there is a more frank discussion happening. Bowler gets then destroyed in the media because he had the audacity to say, Israel doesn't set America's policy. We're a sovereign nation, and to kind of throw shade at Ron Dermer, who was Netanyahu's, political hitman and is now in charge of the negotiations. So a combination of factors kind of blow up the American initiative here. Qatar, in the midst of this bombing, and Egypt come and they get Hamas to agree to a bridge deal, which Hamas said, we don't have to make a bridge deal. We have a deal already that we signed. Israel is violating it. The world should push them on this. But Hamas says, okay, fine. In exchange for returning to that framework, which means negotiating the implementation of phase two. Phase two means all Israeli forces out, occupation over, all Israeli captives and the bodies of deceased captives are released. Thousands of Palestinians held by Israel get released. And then there is the implementation of an enduring plan for peace, followed by reconstruction. Hamas on Saturday night says we agree to that. The next morning, on Sunday, Netanyahu gives a speech where he announces his vision of the final stage of the Gaza genocide, which he said should result in the implementation of what he called Trump's plan, meaning the removal of Palestinians from Gaza. And he says that in the interim, Gaza must be entirely demilitarized, meaning stripping them of their right to resist foreign occupation, which is their right under international law, that all Hamas leadership must be deported from the Gaza Strip, and that Israel retains the right to go inside of Gaza to establish buffer zones, as they call them, inside of Gaza. And all of this takes place in the context of the Israeli defense minister saying that every day that goes by that Hamas does not immediately release the hostages, that they are going to annex and permanently take Palestinian land. And the final aspect of this is that Israel has now put forward a counterproposal saying that they want half of all of the living captives released the moment that this thing is signed. And at the end of a 50-day period, they want the other half of them released, and there will be no guarantees of an actual end to the war. So that's where things stand. And so when people say this thing all ends if Hamas releases the Israelis that it's holding in Gaza, it is not just a lie, it's a lethal lie. It's a lie that requires ignoring 3/4 of a century of history and the past 17 months of conduct by the United States and Israel.
And what do we know about Hamas's willingness to disarm and, share government or leave the governing of Gaza? What have they said about that?
First of all, regarding the governance of Gaza, Hamas has repeatedly said for a couple of months now, we do not want to govern Gaza. We don't need to be the government of Gaza. Our only red line is there cannot be a non-Palestinian entity that comes in to govern Gaza, that it has to be Palestinian. Mustafa Barghouti, who is, I think one of the sharpest Palestinian political actors, he's someone that is constantly engaging, spearheaded initiatives. There were huge meetings that the media didn't cover in Beijing, in Qatar, and elsewhere with all Palestinian factions except Fatah. Fatah, the ruling party of Mahmoud Abbas, who is widely viewed as a kind of agent of the Israeli or an enforcer of the Israeli occupation, didn't participate in it. All of the factions in Palestine, with the exception of the one that is, sort of running the occupied West Bank and assisting Israel in its military operations there, participated, and they all agreed Hamas will not be the governing authority of Gaza. So that issue has been very much public and on the table. One thing also that a lot of people don't understand, because people talk about Hamas as kind of a monolith, and they conflate it with Qassam brigades, the armed wing of Hamas. Prior to October 7th, Hamas's popularity ratings as a governing authority were declining quite quickly. And part of it was due to corruption, perceived repression, brutality, but also the siege, the blockade. Palestinians are like everyone else in the world. What do they want from government? They want some basic level of service. They want competence. They don't want corruption. There was already a lot of discontent prior to October 7th with Hamas as a governing authority. But when you ask Palestinians and you read opinion polling, what you discover is that the concept of armed resistance remains one of the single, if not the single most popular question that people answer in the affirmative. Yes, we support the right of armed resistance. So when people talk about Hamas and they try to conflate it with armed resistance, this is wrong. This is false. So on that question you're asking, Ryan, of disarmament, I don't hear so much Hamas saying that it's Hamas needs to be in possession of the weapons. What Hamas is saying is we're willing to lay down our arms as an entity, as a movement, if there is a force, a Palestinian force in place that is able to defend its people from annexation attempts, from mass killing operations, from more thieving of our land, from blocking our self-determination. That's the position. You can say what you want about it, but Hamas has articulated it, and it rarely gets repeated. They have an argument that is a logical argument. What you can disagree with that, but it is not an illogical argument. It's an argument that is rooted in a 76-year historical arc that from which Palestinians have learned if they give up their land, they don't get it back. If they give up their weapons, they get slaughtered. So, Hamas is in these negotiations. If you really read what they're saying, none of it is illogical. It is all based on fact or history, but you can disagree with it. And you can say, well, you did this operation on October 7th. You are a threat. This is what, Israel is constantly saying. But if you strip away the actual history, then you result in a cartoonish portrayal where Hamas is just a catch-all. The thing you blow your nose with is called tissue paper. Kleenex is a brand, but everyone calls it Kleenex. There's a way in which laziness is doing this about Hamas. There are multiple factions here and multiple strands within Hamas.
One quick basic question I've seen a lot of people ask, and I'm curious for your answer to it. Fatah and the PA are, clearly subcontractors of the Israeli occupation, and yet Netanyahu draws a red line at even the PA having any role in governance in Gaza. So how do we square those two things?
I mean, remember, Mahmoud Abbas is, and I'd be interested in others' thoughts on this too, but just briefly, Mahmoud Abbas is very, very old right now. There's a lot of corruption. It's, it's a decrepit entity in many ways. I think part of what is driving this is that any entity that could be used, especially after Abbas, to encourage Palestinian unity, if you have a change in leadership, if Marwan Barghouti is freed from prison, one of the longest serving prisoners who actually comes from the Fatah movement, he's been number one on the list from Hamas and Islamic Jihad for freedom since the exchange of captives negotiations have started. So part of it has to do with they actually don't want any Palestinians in charge of anything. Part of it is that they're concerned that you would have a resurrection of some national unity entity that already has some infrastructure that could be taken over. And part of it is that they don't want even people that are perceived to be their malleable Palestinians that they have at their disposal to have anything to do with this, because the plan is annihilation. The plan is forced displacement. The plan is ethnic cleansing. I mean, Sharif may have more details about that, but I think it's pretty clear. They just don't want Palestinians to be in charge of anything.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And I think just that Netanyahu and his government just say the quiet part out loud, that the goal is annexation, the goal is total control of historic Palestine. And you can see all the different forms of resistance that Palestinians have engaged with over the years, all the different groups, Hamas, Fatah, PFLP. One of the most significant unarmed demonstrations took place in Gaza with the Great Marches of Return, which began in 2018 on Land Day on 2018 and continued for many weeks. And the Israeli response to that was to calmly and very methodically snipe and shoot Israelis in the Palestinians in their legs with these high-powered bullets that basically exploded on impact. And actually Hassan Abu Sitta, who was there treating Palestinians wounded during that time, told me at the time that they're creating a generation of cripples. That's their response to an unarmed protest. When people take to boycotting, a very effective technique that was used against apartheid South Africa, that is then made illegal. It's called economic terrorism. There's just no plausible way to resist that is acceptable. There's no plausible group, even Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas, who are, yes, subcontractors to the occupation, who killed journalists in Jenin, who have raided and arrested and tortured militants who are fighting against the Israeli occupation. They're not good enough either. So yeah, I think it's just that Netanyahu, as opposed to the Labour Party and others, will say these things out loud and not pretend that they're actually looking for some kind of partner for, so-called peace.
Ryan and Maz, we have a bit of time left, but there's a couple of things I want to make sure that we get to. I want to just shift gears here. Let's talk a bit about the kind of intensifying police state tactics that we're watching now in the United States. And Ryan, you had a really interesting story with Jose Olivares the other day that looked at sort of what's happening with these mass deportations to El Salvador. And of course, the whole, you've had Trump administration officials going down there and filming their videos and with $60,000 Rolexes on their wrists, et cetera. But walk us through the broader picture of this, explain, and then also talk about the story that you guys broke the other day.
I think 101 at least of these men have been said to not have gang affiliations, and the Trump administration has acknowledged that broadly, that of the hundreds of people sent to El Salvador, some of them were what they're calling just illegal immigrants, and therefore they have the right to send them down there. But then if you pinpoint particular ones, the barber is a famous one. The professional soccer player that we wrote about is a famous one. There's another one from Miami that was just reported about in the last couple of days, where he also had a crown tattoo. Like it seems they really went hard at crown tattoos, which is wild because there actually is. It would be one thing if it would be psychotic and absurd to round up everybody with a crown tattoo just because Tren de Aragua, the gang, the Venezuelan gang, had a crown tattoo associated with them. But Tren de Aragua doesn't even have a crown tattoo associated with them. This is just basically a figment of DHS Intel's imagination that, well, crown on a brown person, scary. Let's round them up. So there, when you then go to the State Department with these particular cases, even though they've acknowledged that a sizable chunk of these men were not actually gang members, you go to them and you say, look, this guy's a professional soccer player. Here's all the records from Venezuela. Here's an affidavit from the tattoo artist himself that explains that this tattoo is about Real Madrid, the soccer team he appreciates, or this is about his mother, or whatever it is. They will say, we stand by our intelligence assessment. They're giving no ground whatsoever, and it's unclear how what recourse these men have to challenge their detention. So far, none. There's been eyewitness reporting about, in particular, this barber, for instance, of him being abused in prison and saying, like, I have nothing. What are you doing? I'm not in a gang. I'm here legally, or not here legally. I was in the United States legally applying for asylum. And so what Jose and I reported on is a very interesting secret deal that lies behind the reason why Bukele was willing to accept these Venezuelans and the price that he was paid for them. Bukele and Trump both talk about themselves as these just absolutely heroic fighters against transnational gangs. But when Bukele first came to power, he immediately began negotiations with MS-13, basically carving out portions of the country and negotiating a ceasefire of sorts with MS-13 in exchange for calm. They would get better prison conditions, and they would, you can imagine how a negotiation like that would unfold. FMLN had carried one out back in the early 2010s. It's not unique to Bukele. One of the conditions was that MS-13 would support Bukele in the upcoming election as well. And in that election, he won then kind of a landslide mandate. The ceasefire with MS-13 fell apart, and he launched the kind of more scorched earth campaign that we're familiar with. But the leadership of MS-13, and he has always denied that he took part in these negotiations, but the leadership of MS-13 obviously knows that these negotiations happened. And Jose and I, through a number of federal court documents, were able to show that one of the key leaders of MS-13 that was deported along with these Venezuelans is a man who goes by the name of Greñas, was a part of these negotiations and was headed to his day in court to talk publicly about these talks that he had with Bukele, which are incendiary, politically incendiary for Bukele back at home. He's now been sent back to El Salvador. But the U.S., meanwhile, is holding on to some other key figures, leaders of MS-13, who also have this information as bargaining chips and kind of ransom almost to, or blackmail over Bukele. Like, okay, we've given you grain, yes, but we still have these other guys who can make a huge stink for you back home. Just yesterday, Marco Rubio announced that they had sent another dozen plus MS-13 members back. So there's an ongoing kind of dance between the U.S. And El Salvador over who gets possession of these MS-13 members. The story is fascinating. Jose really took the lead on it, and kudos to him for it. He talks about this one episode where the U.S. really wanted this one MS-13 guy who had been intimately involved in these talks and had a warrant out for his arrest and an extradition request in, and Bukele just let him go. And the guy who had in the government who had led the negotiations drove the gang member basically to the border, and it winds up making his way to Mexico. Then Mexico ends up capturing him, and then the U.S. have a war, over who gets to grab this guy, and the U.S. eventually was able to grab him. So now the U.S. has him. But the whole thing is, it's almost this Hobbesian question of like how, of the formation of a state. Libertarians always talk about a gang, like a state is basically just a gang, that has eventually gotten monopoly over violence, and you're watching it kind of unfold through negotiations in El Salvador.
Yeah, I mean, as you're describing this, and you've done a couple of stories on it. I mean, you mentioned also the football player and the issue of the tattoo. Not
a goaltender, a goalkeeper.
Yeah,
embarrassing correction on my part.
Yeah, it's embarrassing correction. But you have that dimension of it, and then they make these highly produced videos showing this sort of gulag in El Salvador, and then you had this initial sending of people to Guantanamo that took place. We've done a bunch of reporting on that, and in the midst of that, you have a rapidly expanding targeting of students at universities, and they're initially going after people on student visas, but also clearly from Mahmoud Khalil's case and some others, people who are actual legal permanent residents of the United States. And the Trump Justice Department has a kind of evolving retroactive rationale in Mahmoud Khalil's case, and in some of these others too. It seems like they're scooping them up first and then trying to figure out how to make a legal argument to do what they're doing. But we're also seeing reports that the same congressional committee that is serving papers on Colombia, asking for it to hand over disciplinary records. This is something serious that people should understand. It is, people you throw around the term McCarthyism a lot. This committee that is leading this this sort of witch hunt on American universities is one of the closest analogs to the House Un-American Activities Committee that I think we actually have in modern history. And what they're doing is so insidious. It's something that lawyers call jawboning, which is that they're trying to compel a private institution on the basis that it receives funding from the government to violate the free speech rights of its students. And this is not allowed. This is unconstitutional. This has been litigated in courts where you have the government, the First Amendment is something that restricts government conduct. It doesn't bestow you as a person with something. It stops the government from doing things to its people. And so, it talks about Congress not passing laws that abridge these rights. And yet Congress, in this case, is going after these universities and asking them to hand over private disciplinary records. What does that mean? It means that students who were not involved with law enforcement, didn't get arrested by the police, didn't have criminal charges put against them, but did something on their campus that caused them to have to be brought in for an interview with a dean or an assistant dean, or to look at some kind of internal disciplinary process. Congress is saying, we want those records. and we're going to now use those records not only to make threats against the university if they don't expel those students or do otherwise, but we're also going to use those records as part of our hunt to try to find people that we can deport. And these letters are being distributed now to all sorts of universities around the country. And there are indications that hundreds of students have already gotten letters indicating that there is going to be potential deportation proceedings registered against them. Murtaza, you early on did some groundbreaking reporting prior to Mahmoud Khalil being snatched by federal agents and then disappeared for a bit and then eventually ending up in Louisiana. But your thoughts on now what we've seen since you first started reporting on these efforts targeting universities as it expands across the United States and into airports, including when foreign visitors are coming into the country?
Yeah, last year, me and Ryan actually reported the story about this initiative by the Heritage Foundation called Project Esther. And I think Project Esther laid out the groundwork for what we're seeing right now. It was essentially a policy document which was proposed under the guise of combating anti-Semitism in the United States, but really is a very thorough and well thought out, meticulous plan to shut down speech on Israel-Palestine in the United States. They specifically described it as a public-private partnership between the U.S. government and various private entities in the country. You could say NGOs, think tanks, and so forth, to surveil people, to use legal immigration and economic retaliation against them for their speech on the subject, and effectively make it impossible to talk about this issue in the United States in a free and frank manner, such as we're seeing today right now. So I actually was talking to Mahmoud Khalil for some weeks before he was arrested, and neither of us knew that that was going to happen. We were doing reporting about what was going on at Columbia at that time. But now it's kind of clear that the administration has a very, very high threshold and tolerance for what they're willing to do on the subject. And I really do believe it's only the beginning, because we've seen people say not only that they want to deport foreign students, there have been people who said that they want to look back and denaturalizing people in the future as well, too. I think it's not by any means impossible. For those of us people who've been to a naturalization test, one of the questions they ask you on the test is, do you support terrorism? Something to that effect. That can be retroactively used by a motivated administration to say, well, okay, you lied in your naturalization, you support Hamas in our view. That's a very spurious and extreme sort of assertion, but it's by no means beyond the realm of possibility. I think this whole episode has been very revealing that the First Amendment is a very, very important part, not just the Constitution. It's an aspect of American identity that's very, very dear to what people think of themselves as Americans. That is being superseded in a very, very provocative manner by something which has now been deemed more important than the First Amendment, which is the ability, the freedom of action of pro-Israel groups in the United States and the U.S.-Israel relationship. That has been deemed to be a more vital national interest or a vital aspect of being American in the present day than the Constitution. That's literally what's happening at the moment. So I think that, you mentioned the handing over of these disciplinary records. This is essentially the government trying to force schools to help them create blacklists. Blacklists were a very, very important tactic in McCarthyism. Authoritarian regimes around the world have employed blacklists, because that list can be used to systematically deprive those people of rights, not just immigration rights, the rights to banking, the rights to basically having a normal life in this country, making it so oppressive such that, you can be living in a dictatorship, even in a country which continues to publicly proclaim itself as a democracy in general. That is coming into effect right now. And I think it's very tragic that the issue that people decide to sacrifice, these principles upon was supporting the state, which does not share many of our values, not democratic in the way that the United States is engaged in accusations of genocide as per the ICJ and ICC and crimes against humanity. For this subject, it's being deemed effectively illegal to talk about this issue in the future. And now, if you see what's happening at Columbia and Harvard, these other elite institutions, they're trying to change the personnel. They're trying to actually change the curriculums and so forth to make it rigidly pro-Israel, make it even impossible to talk about the very, well-documented, obvious things that's happening in Israel-Palestine, the settlements, annexation, genocide, and so forth. It's going to become verboten. You're going to be like the Soviet Union, where you had to use samizdat and allusions and fictional novels to talk about what's happening right in front of you. We're headed in that direction at the moment. And, I think that it's interesting to be alive at that moment, to see
Yeah.
what finally broke the camel's back. It was Israel.
And what's been so striking to me has been the complete capitulation by Columbia and Harvard and all of civil society in the United States, but in particular Columbia and Harvard, because they had incredible court cases. Like they would have won these cases in court. And our former colleague Glenn Greenwald had a good way of, I think, explaining to people who are just following the kind of talking points. And one of the talking points that you hear from the censors is, look, no university has a right to federal funding. So therefore, Trump, if he doesn't like what you're doing and he thinks you're anti-Semitic or you're anti-Israel, he can take your funding away. And the way Glenn explains it is the constitutional law is the other way around. That if you're already giving federal funding for something, you cannot restrict it based on speech. And his example, which I think will help people internalize it, is, let's say there's you're getting unemployment benefits. It is illegal for the United States to have a test that says you must swear fealty to Democrats or swear fealty to Trump, or if we have found you tweeting against Black Lives Matter or for Black Lives Matter or against Israel, you will lose your unemployment benefits. Like, once a benefit exists, it exists for everybody, and you can't pull it back. So Columbia and Harvard would have won these cases in the courts, even with this Republican Supreme Court. They also have multi-billion-dollar endowments that would have allowed them to weather this storm, but it would have cost them, because of the nature of cash flow and the nature of returns on investments. Although their hedge funds are probably getting wiped out right now thanks to Trump's trade wars, but they could have drawn down from their endowment $200 million to make up for the money that was being pulled from them, and then fought this out in court and stood up for civil society and stood up for academic freedom. That was a choice that was very much available to them because of the size of their endowments. They chose not to do that. Even in Harvard's response to the administration, which is, Harvard has completely capitulated. They fired the Turkish scholar who runs, Maz, you may know his name, I forget his name, but he's very widely respected, mild-mannered guy who runs the Middle East the studies department at Harvard. They fired him, fired the deputy as well. Who knows, what Vichy academic they're going to bring in. They do all that, and they're still, the Trump administration coming in and saying they're going to cut $8 billion in funding from Harvard. And the Harvard president responded by saying, "You're right. We have a deep anti-Semitism problem. We're going to root it out. Thank you, Mr. President." And Trump loves nothing more than seeing people bend the knee like that to him. He sees the weakness and he just goes in on it.
The Tren de Agua people should get a Tesla T tattoo as their new logo, right, and see if maybe they're going to
don't put a crown on it. Yeah,
don't put a crown on it. Apparently, that's no good, or just a big Trump stake. But on this issue, there's a dimension that's even worse than, I agree with everything you said, Ryan. But in the Mahmoud Khalil case, what's wild is that Khalil's lawyers are the ones who sought a temporary injunction to prohibit Columbia from handing over private disciplinary records. Columbia was not the entity fighting it. It was one of their students. And so his lawyers then tried to prohibit Columbia from capitulating. So, I mean, Columbia itself has totally capitulated. There was some delays because a lawyer representing one of their students who was kidnapped by federal agents, his lawyers filed that. And it's, they wouldn't have even had to tap that endowment, because there are so many constitutional law scholars and organizations in the United States that gladly would have come to the defense of Columbia in this case, including their own graduates from '68 era.
They would have had to tap it to make up for all the NIH grants that were.
I get I take the point. I think you're right. Yeah. I'm just saying, like, it's mind blowing how easily these elite institutions have folded, and then you look at the fight. The bravery of so many young people who are confronting this right now, and compare it to the institutional cowardice among all of these, elite universities refusing to stand up for their students at the most basic level, but also refusing to adhere to any of the values that they promote. Columbia was an institution that advertised its role in the '68 protests. I mean, Juan Gonzalez, the co-host of Democracy Now!, I remember in the 90s being in the studio with him at Democracy Now! The day that he finally was given his diploma from Columbia University because of his participation in the 1968 uprisings. But that university advertises that history to people and then completely sells it out. We only have a few minutes left, but there's a couple of things quickly I wanted to get to. Either Sharif or Murtaza, if you want to take this, I want to ask about Yemen, which has been under George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. Yemen was bombed once. In 2002, they did a drone strike there and they killed 6 people, one of whom was an American citizen. And this was supposedly people that had been involved with the bombing of the USS Cole when Bill Clinton was president, one of the single deadliest direct attacks on an American ship by a non-state actor in history. And then you had this gap until Obama becomes president in 2009, and Obama initiates a secret air war early on in his presidency of his first term, doing mostly drone strikes, but there were also cruise missile attacks. And then that gave way then to a much wider systematic bombing campaign that the United States and Britain were facilitating. And the Saudis were sort of the tip of the spear of a lot of that, but it was an entirely American-focused entity, and it played a big role in creating massive political instability within Yemen. And then you had the emergence of Ansar Allah taking control, the Houthis taking control of large parts of the northern part of Yemen and seizing the capital, Sana'a. And this had been an organization that during the Bush and Obama eras, the government of Yemen, the former dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh, had repeatedly tried to convince the United States, and we know this from WikiLeaks cables, that the United States should allow the Yemeni government to use American counterterrorism funding and weapons to fight against the Houthis. And Fran Townsend, who's a Republican, who was a former counterterrorism official under Bush, says in one of the diplomatic cables that they're trying to imply that they're an Iranian proxy, and it's just the evidence just isn't there. And U.S. officials I interviewed over the years said that they share slogans with Iran. Yes, they have affinity, but there's no evidence that Iran is actually arming or financing the Houthis in any significant way. And part of what's happened is that there was a self-fulfilling prophecy that emerged as a result of U.S. policy. And the Houthis then take power, and they were the only entity really representing a nation state beyond Iran, but did more action than Iran, that responded militarily, directly attacking Israel in response to the genocide in Gaza. And their Red Sea blockade has been incredibly effective. It has damaged the Israeli economy in a real way. It's caused shipping to have to route all the way around the southern coast of Africa to go north again. And it's been one of the most effective responses by any player outside of Palestine to Israel's genocide. And now we have Trump unleashing what I believe it's the heaviest concentrated bombing that the United States has ever done against Yemen. And Trump just yesterday posted on Truth Social that it's going to intensify, and that they're going to now try to wipe out the entire Houthi leadership.
It's interesting. The Houthis, it's not, as you mentioned, it's not the first time they've been bombed. They've been bombed also by the Emiratis and the Saudis for many, many years with U.S. backing. It's actually had a very interesting impact on the way they organize themselves, because they've organized their entire force to be resilient and to be light and to evade airstrikes. So they have these underground bunkers and so forth, which are very, very hardened, very difficult to destroy with airstrikes. But also they don't have a lot of heavy equipment to target. So these attacks, I remember there's a very famous quote by Biden. Someone asked him, do you think the bombing is going to be successful? And he indicated effectively, no, he didn't think it would be successful, but they're going to do it anyways. For lack of options. So Trump is not doing the same thing. He's going to bomb Yemen. He's going to bomb the Houthis to try to stop them from enacting this Red Sea blockade. They've shown no willingness or indication they're going to back down at any time in the past 18 months. And he's continuing again to escalate, only with further bombing. There's no indication that will work either. The Houthis have been developed their entire military posture to they've become anti-fragile, if you quote Nassim Taleb, and how to respond to a certain type of attack. So it'll probably be futile. It'll probably kill some innocent people. It'll probably destroy some buildings in Yemen. Probably already has, but it's very unlikely it's going to result in the Houthis surrendering, stopping their attacks and so forth. The one thing that could stop the attacks, and they've said very clearly, and you've reported about this, and we've covered a lot of drop site, is that if the war in Gaza stops, they're fighting in solidarity with the war in Gaza, with the genocide taking place in Gaza, and they've said very clearly that if that war ends, the Red Sea blockade can end and shipping can continue and so forth as well. That's a political solution which should be on the table any day, to much more likely be effective than bombing them futilely for another several years. But that's the one option that no one seems to want to take at the moment. So, it's interesting. The Houthis, as you said, a very important historical point, when they first took Sana'a, the Iranians told them not to. They said, no, we're going to take it. They're a very independent group. They may take arms from the Iranians or others. They may have ideological overlap, but they're their own group. And whatever divisive or unpopular they were before this war, what they've done now in acting in solidarity with the blockade and taking many hits and attacking Israel directly in solidarity with Gaza, that has made them very popular in the region, in Yemen and beyond, because they're pretty much the only group which has done that. And they've been sort of quite resilient in the face of assaults, not just by Israel, but by the UK, by the US now as well too. And I don't foresee the war in Yemen, this current iteration of the war in Yemen, ending absent an end to the war in Gaza. And I think that the implications for Red Sea shipping and the global economy and so forth will continue to manifest as long as that war continues.
We're going to wrap up here. We really want to thank everyone for tuning into this, and we promise we're gonna do more of this in the weeks to come, and we may even have a regular time slot where we just kind of chat with various colleagues and also bring in some other people. You're on mute there, Ryan, if you were trying to make a joke about me.
No, I was saying we might do 9:30 a.m. Tuesday if this ends up working for everybody.
I did want to, though, on a closing note, I want to throw it to Sharif, because as we mentioned earlier, yet another one of our Palestinian journalist colleagues has been killed today. And when our colleague Hossam Shabat, who was a correspondent for Al Jazeera Mubashir and Dropsite, was assassinated, we put out a statement saying that we hold both the Israeli and the U.S. governments accountable, and I know I speak on behalf of everyone involved with Dropsite when we say that we look at the silence from so many of our colleagues in the U.S., British, and Western media with a deep sense of shame that more people have not been standing up, as more than 200 journalists, media workers have been killed in Gaza, and there's just silence about it. And we see you. I was consistent in saying that I think Evan Gershkovich should be freed from Putin's prison in Russia. There are journalists like Jake Tapper. They're posting about that all the time, about Evan Gershkovich, but have nothing to say about the mass murder of our Palestinian colleagues. I've called for an end to repression against Fox News journalists. And on that note, Trey Yingst, who is the chief foreign correspondent for Fox News, someone that I'm sure I have many, many disagreements with, has gone out of his way multiple times to make the point that Palestinian journalists should be protected and that they're brave and that they deserve to live so that they can do their job. The fact that a Fox News journalist is one of the only major figures in American corporate media to repeatedly make that point says something really, really damning about the broader state of integrity among so many big-time journalists, prominent journalists in the U.S. and elsewhere. But Sharif, you had a very close working relationship with Hossam. You were editing him, you were translating him, you were in regular touch with him. I give you the last word to talk about the state of our journalistic colleagues in Gaza.
Yeah, I just wanted to remind people what they're going through. Our journalist colleagues in Gaza, Abu Bakr Abed, who is a regular contributor to Dropsite, is starving, basically. He's malnutritioned. He's eating pet food. He's 22 years old. He's been weakened. He's also, I mean, as anyone would, psychologically bearing the brunt of witnessing such genocidal assault. Rasha Abu Jalal almost died on March 18th. The room where she sleeps with her family and her husband and 5 children collapsed when the house next to her was bombed, which killed 11 people, including an 8-year-old girl. She was just happened to be sleeping in the next room because it was warmer. They're now living with relatives. She told me that journalists are so systematically targeted that when journalists move in, because of, as we know, people have been displaced multiple times, and it's not always, even sometimes in a tent, but if it's in another apartment, the neighbors tell them to leave. They don't want them to live next to them because they're afraid that they're going to be bombed because they're journalists. This is the level that we're living in right now. And it's not just being killed. One of the first, actually the first Palestinian journalist that was a contributor to Dropsite News was Mujahid al-Saadi, who has been in prison without charge since September now. I think he's in Megiddo. I can't imagine what the conditions are. We haven't talked at all about the West Bank in this conversation, but Walid Ahmed, what prisoner rights groups are saying, the first child, essentially, he's 17 years old, under 18, just died in prison. He became the 63rd prisoner to die since October 2023 in prison. They think they're unclear what the cause of death was, but we know the conditions in these prisons are absolutely horrific. And then, yes, I don't think I will ever get over Hossein, really. But yeah. I think the Writers Against War in Gaza did a very beautiful thing. There's a tradition in the streets of Palestine to print and display the posters of Palestinian martyrs to honor them as heroes. And they put out posters you can download and print. So I encourage people to do that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sharif. And I know the sorrow and grief that you're expressing is shared by all of us. Just a total shock to the system that's been replicated more than 200 times as they've targeted our colleagues. And I want people that are subscribers to Dropsite to know that we received a message from Hossam Shabbat's friends about how much writing for Dropsite meant to him. And the support that people have given us too makes it possible for us to work with reporters in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria, and elsewhere. And we're really humbled and grateful to our readers and our supporters. And if you're not a paid subscriber to Dropsite and you don't have the means to become one, we understand, but spread the word about Dropsite News and the journalism that we do and the kind of on-the-ground reporting that you won't hear anywhere else. People that are paid subscribers, you have our gratitude for backing us financially. It's how our journalism is fueled and funded. You can make 501c3 tax-deductible donations to Dropsite by going to dropsitenews.com, and you could click on ways to donate. Most importantly, though, is just to spread the word and to try to take a moment out of your day also to remember the Palestinian journalists who make a lot of the coverage that you read on Dropsite possible. We promise to do this more with our readers. We always appreciate feedback. There's multiple ways to contact us on our website. On behalf of everyone at Dropsite News, we thank you all for joining us. Thank you for having our back. We'll see you next time. I'm Jeremy Scahill.